Okay, this was designed as a bit of an intellectual punch-up, but it's not going to be that anymore. And you can see the way we set out things. We have more of a discussion. And there is a reason for that. It's because if we had had a punch-up, it would have been based on false positions or pretend, basically. Somebody would have had to pretend that they had a very sort of dogmatic view. And neither of our participants in this discussion wanted really to pretend to have a dogmatic view. So, let me introduce you to three very good friends of mine and colleagues. Christopher Arnold is going to chair this. The reason is he doesn't know Melissa Benn or Sebastian O'Kelly. And I'm now going to hand over to him. This is a bit of an experiment. Be what's the word? Generous and considerate, but you get a chance to ask questions yourself. Okay.
Thanks, Brian. We're going to start with two opening position statements, and I'm going to ask Seb if you'll go first. Okay? You wind up.
Yeah. Oh, I'm wound up. Okay, that's great. Christopher, thanks very much for inviting me to your conference, and thanks very much to all of you for being here and for listening to me speak about something about which I know considerably less than every single person in this room. And no thanks at all to my old college friend from Farnborough Tech, Brian Apter, who landed me in this invidious role of having to discuss school policy with such an outstanding advocate for comprehensive education like Melissa Benn. I have not been entirely idle before this conference and have read extensively her books, her blogs, articles, and other material, and it's an absolutely magnificent monument of work. I congratulate her for her social engagement with schooling. I think she makes an absolutely powerful argument for the proposition that we're now discussing, which, unless it's changed, which is a fair possibility, the focus of government policy should be to fund, improve and champion comprehensive education to such an extent that private and selective education withers away. I have absolutely no quibble with that whatsoever. So, the original proposition sort of seemed to imply that that we should ban private schools. Now, obviously, many of you, I think, will dislike private schools intensely. I didn't like them myself personally when I was briefly at them, but banning them, I think, would cause the sort of shriek of pain that we haven't really heard in education. I think things could get, I don't know that a ban would work, but I will just go on to the subject of them withering away, and that is that I think there is a possibility of that, and I think there's one reason for it is a very bleak one, which is I think that younger generation of parents, even really relatively affluent middle-class ones, are not going to be able to afford it, at least not at the rates that we've got now. So we are seeing, an era of extreme volatility, I think, in terms of social mobility, in terms of sort of inequitable inequality in wealth, and I think that this will soon be addressed, and the electorate will be making their feelings very clear on this subject. So I wouldn't say that the picture in 30 years' time is going to be what it is now, and the picture that it was 30 years ago, which I am going to describe because it was my own personal experience, was very different. So I wouldn't give up all hope that it does wither away. And the effect of private education going, I would obviously weaken the argument for selection, and politicians wouldn't feel that they have to address the issue of selection. Parents might not get so nervous about the issue of selection, and you could well see a consolidation of comprehensive education. I mean, I'm perfectly well aware of other societies which do have comprehensive education. I have visited quite a number of, I worked in schools in Naples when I used to live there, and I still keep up contact with Italy. And the idea of that you pay for private education in southern Italy is an anathematum, which is odd because, you know, southern Italy, just about everything in southern Italy is a fix. You know, any job, anything to do with cash is usually goes to connections. But the one thing that is equitable is school. It's a pretty bleak school, I have to say. It's a building, it's a teacher, it's a curriculum, and it's exams. So if you want to play a musical instrument or learn anything else or play sport and all that, you do it in your own time. I think I've got to sort of apologise that you were built up to have this sort of debate, because I'm in no way qualified to do it, and I've suggested numerous other people to front this up, and I would be particularly interested in views from people on the Labour Party who might well find that they are taking up the burden of government rather quicker than they assume, and will need to have some policies in place. So I would be interested in, you know, what Andrew Adonis has to say, and you know, Angela Rayner and others. You know, I mean, Justin Madders, an excellent young Labour MP, would be very good. Who heads the all-party parliamentary group on social mobility, would be an excellent person to have invited. But I'm sorry, you've got me, and my only qualification. I mean, I have no qualification for this. I went to private school. I was kicked out at 14. It had obviously a disruptive effect on. I can't say I bear great scars from it, thank goodness, and possibly less than if I'd remained there. I've always thought, you know, rugby school expelled me, and I thought that was their failing, not mine, frankly. I was damned if I was going to feel a failure, because they thought they were disrupted by a slightly playful but good-natured 13-year-old, you know. I mean, you sort of go to hell already. It's just not, it was their problem, not mine, and I've redeemed myself, as it were, through the salvation of Farm Protect, besides friends like Brian. So it was it had a positive side, shall we say. But and I guess I'd better just explain that I'm a journalist by background, and that I'm currently involved in landlord and tenant law and leasehold tenure, which is a grossly unfair area of law. And we have an all-party parliamentary group of 132 MPs, including Melissa's brother, who just joined before Christmas, and we are changing the law and making home ownership a fairer thing than it is at the moment, because any block of flats you see has been parcelled up now into various little investment instruments bought up by speculators, often offshore. Sorry, a digression, but it cannot be right that a democracy has allowed £260 billion of commercial and residential property to be owned by anonymous offshore entities about which we know nothing at all. And this is what I'm occupying myself, and I think it's probably the most socially useful journalism I do. It's not your area, but that's what I come from. I'm sorry that obviously I consulted friends and people who who work in comprehensives, and spoke to my wife indeed about this, who went to a comprehensive in West Wales, and she was. I said, would you have been happy, you know, if our daughters had gone to the same school? And she said yes, and I would have been too. Her only gripe about that comprehensive was that she took the initiative to apply for Cambridge and passed the exams, and the comp messed up the bureaucracy, and she lost her place. So, you know, that comprehensive in Pembrokeshire lost its once-a-decade Oxbridge candidate, and understandably she's a bit bitter about that, but Cambridge's loss was my gain, and we met at Farnborough at Cardiff University, and married and had 2 children. And when it came to their education, we did send them to private schools, and I'm quite happy to discuss that choice. You know, I'm well aware of all the sort of options that ambitious middle-class parents have in London, how we play the system. Melissa nails it. She identifies the bogosity of the faith schools. I considered a faith school. I thought, you know, free education was worth a prayer or two for my daughters, and so I could rediscover some sort of Catholic faith, which I've never really had, but I discounted that almost immediately, because, you know, it would mortify me if my daughters had, you know, hadn't been poetic justice if they'd become nuns, you know, or something. So, you know, I know a friend of mine in North London considered the same thing at the same time. She looked at sending her son to the Free Jewish school there, but when inquiries were made that she had to provide her birth certificate of her grandmother, she thought, hold on, I don't think I really like this, sending them to another school, and you know. So I'm afraid there's a whole load of things that if you want to ask me about, I'm quite happy to talk about. But the general experience of my children was very happy at schools. They went to a Girls' Day public school, Trust School, Streatham and Clapham Hill. It's not the most prestigious private school in the country, I would say, but it did a very good sort of education for them, and they did sixth form at Allains in Dulwich, which is the sort of co-ed, liberal, nice school that beside Dulwich College. It's the same foundation. And obviously you're aware that very recently Shami Chakrabarti, the Shadow Attorney General, made public her decision to send her son to Dulwich, and got some adverse publicity. But I applaud her courage for speaking out about that, and I didn't know she can't really speak about it much more because there's a child involved, really. But it did strike me as odd that she sent her child to Dulwich, I have to say, because it's quite a formal school. It was the alma mater of Nigel Farage, which and possibly to many more millions of people's enjoyment, it was also the alma mater of P.G. Woodhouse. So I wouldn't draw any great conclusion for that. But it seemed to me an odd choice. I'll talk very briefly about my. This enters the realm of interesting and irrelevant social history, which is my school days. That term is Melissa's, by the way, to describing Jonathan Miller's son's unhappy experiences, comprehensive education. But because it is, it was obviously had an effect on me, and I think it's probably had an effect on people driving private kind of reforms in education. I'll talk about it. And that is, I went to a perfectly normal, happy prep school in Hindhead in Surrey. It's called St Edmund's School, and then this really rather stupid decision was taken by my parents to send me to Rugby, where my father had gone, but where he was paid for by assistants, really, and had been utterly miserable. And up there I went, and I was a bit naughty, bit mischievous, bit playful, but that's about it. Sorry, 2 minutes. Oh, right, well, I'll really speed up in that case. I mean, the interesting thing about the public school then was that it was run by the boys. They ran all the administration, all the school, with their sort of hierarchy of prefects. I have to say that the culture of the boys was sane, healthy, and modern. It was tolerant. There was no bullying. Prefects could beat. They never did. They tolerated sort of drinking, smoking, adolescent homosexuality, which was absolutely routine and tolerated. No grief. The only rule was, don't let these sins come before the masters. And unfortunately, I asked around to the degree that I came up before my rather nervy, ambitious housemaster, who was the only adult in the entire complex, by the way, the only adult male in the whole complex, and he was a vicious fellow who beat me once with, at least keeping control of himself, and then thrashed me really viciously, and sort of beat me up a bit, throttled me, all that sort of stuff. And I think because I'd seen it wasn't a brutal, I don't really regard it as too brutal. I'd seen his cloven hoof, and he hated that, and I think that was really what was the culminating thing for me going. And of course, once you are kicked out of one of these institutions, you fall like a stone. I've done my bit for social mobility in the opposite direction, if you like. You fall like a stone through the education system. And no private school wants to touch you, no state school either. And my mother was a bit ill, so things were a bit chaotic at home, shall we say. But I really had my 14 and 15th year was spent really being educated by a sort of Anglican priest who sort of, retired, who sort of took me in until I went on my 16th birthday to Farnborough Tech and received redemption. Do I wish I'd gone to a comprehensive? Absolutely. I would have been much happier at a comprehensive. I would have fitted into that culture fine. I fitted into the culture of Farnborough Tech fine. I think I was a bit of an oddity. But I liked it, and I think it would have been a much better, more rounded and happy education. And I'm afraid to say that I don't regret for an instant that I was chucked out of Rugby School. It's something I've hidden, I have to say, for years, because it's not exactly a CV-enhancing thing, and, and I've only just talked to my daughter about it, but then it's something that you wanted to keep, I didn't want to encourage her to, go off the rails, as it were. But, it was quite funny in my professional life, say, at Daily Telegraph features meeting, where I'd be in a meeting with, say, Charles Moore and Boris Johnson and Paul Goodman, who became a Tory MP. We were a very diverse lot. I mean, I think the news editor went to a grammar school, but the assumption on their part was we were all public school boys, but I was a fraud, as it happens, and I'm very glad I was. I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Seb. And now it's Melissa's turn.
Okay, I'm going to sit down because I've actually written a more formal speech. Can everybody hear me? Can everybody hear me at the back? I think Brian hinted at the fact this has been a really a movable feast of a debate, and with discussions about the title of the motion going up to the wire till 5 o'clock last night. And in fact, I got a message from Brian, a missed call from Brian this morning. I thought, oh my God, he's changed the debate again. And now I come in and see it says, would you put your child in a private or selective school? Well, I'm not going to answer that question. I haven't. I'm interested in Sebastian's experience. I hope we'll talk about it. I did start out in private education, actually. I went to the same school as George Osborne until, obviously he's like way younger than me, and has many other disadvantages as well. But I'm going to do quite a sort of straight political speech, and actually it plays to my passion of the moment, which is, I think it is an age-related thing. I think it's now, having seen governments come and go, secretaries of state come and go, now that we've got Jeremy Corbyn, politics has shifted once again. I'm really interested in how we could contribute to the withering away of private and selective education. And so, and I want to address that question. And I want to take it beyond the realm of utopia, unrealistic, because, one of the most interesting things, say, about private education, and I'm sure you'd agree, Sebastian, is that everybody agrees it's a bad thing. Everybody agrees that it has a bad impact on society. But there's also, as David Kynaston said, a real lack of real, genuine discussion about what we can do about it. David Kynaston is a social historian who is a really acute critic of private schools. So as I say, I'm interested in showing how we can begin to achieve it. And here, I think it's important to remember that our education system is created by humans who can make different political, economic, policy and personal choices. And there's been a lot of discussion recently, because of Jeremy Corbyn, because of anniversaries, about the Attlee government of the post-war period. And there we saw, I think the war was a huge background to the radical change of that period, but we saw how governments can just put in place major social and economic and educational change. And also, in its own way, the coalition, how many years is it since the coalition came in? Well, if you count the Tories after, it's now 8 years. And, they have, do you remember Andrew Lansley? Disastrous reconfiguring of the health service. And then Michael Gove, I would argue, largely disastrous, but very well masked disastrous reconfiguring of education. So I don't see why a Labour or a left government or a progressive government, or actually, as I'm going to argue, a national consensus can be built to do something different. And I am going to talk about it in national terms, because again, it may be age is withering my sort of dogmatism, which I was invited here to display. But the term National Education Service interests me in a number of ways. And one of them is, I think we have to come up with a system that more people can agree on than disagree on. And I think there's been shifts within the centre-right of our political world that are hopeful. So I'll come on to that. So 2 questions I'm going to ask. Why is it important, and how might it be achieved? I think the why I'm going to skip over, because I know we have time issues. Not skip over, but say just touch on what we all know. England has always, England and Wales, because Scotland and Northern Ireland have their own arrangements, but England has always been a deeply divided educational system. And I was reminding myself for this debate, in between Brian's phone calls about the change title of it, about the history of our education system, going back, I only went back to the 18th century, sorry. But, you know, there's always been this very clear divide, an education for the upper classes, an education for the middle to upper classes, and then an education for the common people. And I think you could argue, you could certainly argue in an undergraduate essay, that we still pretty well have that kind of system. I don't want to underplay the enormous advances that I was also reminding myself of the changes from the 1870 Act through 1902, the 1944 Act, the post-war creation of a universal education system, but a huge mistake, I think, divided according to the grammars, and there were going to be the technical schools that didn't take off, and the secondary moderns. And then, of course, comprehensive reform in the 1960s. But the point is, here we are in 2018, we still have a very powerful private sector, which in some ways has become even more of an international business. I'm sure you'd agree with that. We have various forms of state subsidy of different kinds for the middle classes within the state system, and then we have the education of the poor who get less, and get less both culturally and in terms of resources, so that a state-educated child has between 4,000 and 8,000 spent on them a year, compared to, you know, Westminster, we all know the figures, 33,000 a year spent on their education. So there you have the alchemy of privilege, the privileged getting the most privileged resources. We also know what the results of that are: 7% educated privately, but 50% of barristers or judges, I think it's a higher number of judges, are independently educated. 74% of judges, actually. 51% of leading print journalists. 61% of the country's top doctors. In fact, MPs, it's a slightly lower level from private education. I think that's interesting, and it's partly because the political class have to be more aware of popular pressure about this. But so the harm is profound, and I'm going to give you the main reasons why I think it's so profound. Firstly, I think it segregates the better off, well, it segregates the rich from the rest. And I think this has a psychological aspect. I interviewed somebody for one of my books, and she had gone to, it's not the same day school as your daughter's, I think, Godolphin. And she said to me, I've never had the first idea about my place in society, and I still don't. That visceral sense of not knowing how to cope away from my norm. Well, actually, was a very sort of self-reflective woman. She'd been the head girl. No, she went to St. Paul's, I remember that. So there's that side where actually, and I saw it in my own father who went privately, who as time went on, and as he became older and older, reflected more and more on what he didn't understand and didn't know about his own society. So I think I had that conversation with him. We trusted each other. We had that open conversation. We had been sent to state schools, and so we used to compare what was learned and lost across the sectors. Of course, the real impact of that divide is on those children who are not having a private or privileged education. And Lindsay Handley, who's a very interesting writer, has said ultimately the most damaging aspect of class is not money and power. Some people might argue about that, but the combined forces of outright snobbery and tacit distinction, because they contribute to the undermining of self in poorer and less well-off children. Secondly, I think private education creates leaders who are profoundly out of touch with the majority. All I'll say there is Boris Johnson, austerity, the coalition, Nick Clegg. And whenever I watched that Rose Garden thing going on, I just thought, you know what this is about? This is Eton versus St. Paul's. This is not about the country. And I think arguably their policies reflected that. Thirdly, it siphons large amounts of public money that could be directly put into state schools, the subsidy through charitable status. But I think my biggest bugbear of the recent years has been it's created a false idea of what makes a good school. And I'm sure you'll agree with me, Sebastian. So from Andrew Adonis, who I don't like as much as you politically, I'm sure he's a very nice man, through to Michael Gove, it's always been, let's make state schools like private schools, let's learn from the private schools. So it's, and they bring up all sorts of things, the independence of private schools, the structural independence of private schools, uniforms, team sports, character building, better discipline, and so on. But I don't think that's I don't think that's the point. I have nothing against most of those things. I'm not madly into team sports, but I'm sure a lot of people in the state sector are. It's about the alchemy of privilege. That's why it is. If you take children who come from better off homes and you give them so much more, you are just creating that gap. And you cannot, you know, there is an argument, particularly within the free schools and academy movement, that state schools can do it, and they should approach it in terms of culture, not cash. And Fiona Miller, who's a columnist and somebody I've worked with over this issue for many years, did a debate in the summer where one side was arguing it's not a problem of resources, and I see that Justine Greening, before she lost her job, said exactly the same thing. It's all about attitude, culture, not cash. I just don't agree. I think it's cash plus culture plus the very important fact that most private schools, all private schools, even if they're low cost, are away from the problems of society that send children into school that are hungry, tired, bothered, haven't slept, haven't eaten anything for breakfast, which is a large part of the difficulty that the state sector faces. So that's the problem of private schools. In the state system, grammar's largely faded away. We still have 165, and we still have a Prime Minister, judged by the sacking of Justine Greening, who wants to bring back grammar schools. What a disaster. You know, my argument here is they are really a state subsidy for the middle classes. You come from a privileged home, you have cultural capital, you get coaching on top of it. 1 to 3% of poorer children get into grammar schools. I think all the noise around improving access for poorer children to grammar schools is just noise. I think we have to phase out selection in the state system. Now, look, coming on to the how, because I know that time is, how do we go about changing things? And I've really tried to think about this seriously rather than just be a polemicist. Obviously, we have to create a consensus of some kind for progressive change. And, you know, we know from countries like Finland that did abolish their private and selective schools in the 60s and 70s, it can be done. I know it's a very, very different culture. And I've now learned it's about a long period of change and a lot of debate. And my take on the Gove years is that actually it has something optimistic in it, which is that the centre-right have come round to opposing the 11 plus and the divide at 11. And the free school and academy movement that has so many problems about it does believe in the human educability of all children. In the 60s, that argument mainly came from the left, and that may have been part of the problem with the comprehensive movement and the enormous hostility there is to it. But the right now have a view about human educability, but they have a different view of what is involved in it, about content, about the kind of schools. If you look at a school, there's always a school in the headlines that are always being told about. Currently, it's Michaela School in my home borough of Brent. No excuses, you know, a particular kind of curriculum. Whatever you think about it, and I think a lot of things, it's saying poor children deserve a good education and they can achieve far more highly than we believe they can. So I think that is a basis for consensus. 2 minutes, right. And I think the fight for selection last year, which Theresa May lost through losing the election, but she also lost the argument within mainstream educational opinion. You know, Michael Wilshaw, former Chief Inspector of Schools, lots of people on the right. I did lots of meetings with people who were against selection, and I remember talking about it at your last year conference. Secondly, I think we have to talk more about comprehensive success, and we have to talk about how we build on it. You compare selective Buckinghamshire, comprehensive Hampshire. Comprehensive Hampshire has done really, really well. They're quite similar authorities. They're well off, kind of Tory, southern England, more or less, authorities. And Hampshire's done incredibly well. We have to talk about those countries internationally that have broadly comprehensive systems that have done very well. And again, we can draw in a new generation of a different political stripe. I urge you all to look at Lucy Crean's book, Cleverlands, about some of the top performing systems internationally, and she has at the end 5 criteria for a good comprehensive system, which this country, if you know Jeremy Corbyn's government implemented it, would make a huge difference to our system. Thirdly, we have to accept the resources argument. It's not culture. It's culture plus cash plus a lot of other things. So somebody has to make the argument that money has to be spent and it has to come from somewhere. And I think we have to replace a meritocratic ideal. I don't think schools are the main engine of social mobility. I think the economy and changes in occupational structure are. And I think our schools should be divorced from economic aims. The aim should be to give every young person a good education. And that is a different aim. So my final point is, let's learn from Clement Attlee. He's a really interesting figure. And somebody was writing about him recently and said that he combined an absolute commitment to principle with an abundant and prolific appetite for conciliation. And I think that's what we have to do now. We have to say comprehensive education is what a 21st century well-off country can afford and should afford. We need to bring as many people into that debate as we can, but we shouldn't compromise on the principle, which we have seen has been compromised from the 1960s onwards. So my final point is, we need lots of conversations about this, lots of conversations like this where it's not you did that, you did that. I'm not interested in what Shami Chakrabarti did, I'm interested in what Jeremy Corbyn's government does. And also, I think we need a series of commissions. If I were Jeremy Corbyn and I were Prime Minister in a year's time, and it gives me actually I get hairs rising on not the thought of me being Prime Minister, the thought of him being Prime Minister, I would set up a number of modern equivalent of national commissions, looking at how we can move towards a universal system, looking at how the private schools can either become completely independent, which will mean they'll be a lot more expensive, or come into the state system, look at how we need to reform our state education system so it's truly excellent. The left has always talked too much about social inclusion and not enough about educational quality. And that's why Gove did quite well. We have to do that, talk about educational quality. And that, I know, I can see you, and actually I'm on my last sentence, so that's my argument. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. We're now going to ask Seb to respond to that. So I've got some prompts here if we need them, followed by Melissa responding, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. So, Seb?
Well, I mean, there's really interesting points there, and I think that, everyone's got to sort of throw up one's hand and acknowledge some of this. I mean, that particularly the business of, the purpose of private education is to purchase privilege, I guess. I mean, that's to put it at its most blunt. But that really wasn't what motivated me and my wife when we sent our daughters to school. We wanted to go. We live in Balham, Tooting, and sort of SW17, and we wanted to send our children to the Honeywell, which is a state primary, but we were slightly too far out of the catchment area. Howard Davis, who's an economist who was always on the telly before 1997, married to Sue Nye, former chief of staff of Gordon Brown. I mean, he bought a house, lived in Islington, but he bought a house in Wandsworth in order to send the child to that school. So it was that was a pretty commercial, or rather it was a financial way of getting into it. So I couldn't see that was much of a difference to us sending our children to GDST school in Streatham. And I don't think I really haven't sort of thought through. I mean, my take on private education was, well, it's quite good, one child out of the state education system. So it's, everybody benefits, I suppose. And I accept that it was a short-sighted and unanalyzed view, but I think that probably was mine at the time when I was a sort of, whatever I was in my late 30s, or early 40s, when my daughter went to school. So I mean, don't underestimate necessarily the ignorance of people who use the private sector on the social effects of what they do. I think it might be pretty widespread. But I acknowledge the advantages of it. It is a difficult thing, this. As Melissa was saying, these schools, I think every school, private school that I've been involved with, long predates the state responsibility for education, not by a few years, but by centuries. Rugby School was set up by a guy called Lawrence Sheriff, he was a sort of Waitrose for the Court of Queen Elizabeth I. You know, he made a packet of money and endowed this sort of fund to support the poor in Rugby, and somehow or other that's been transformed into a kind of boarding school for, you know, the sons of professional middle classes, in my case, from the home counties. And that's quite obviously wrong. I'm absolutely with Melissa on some of this commercial stuff of private education. Well, I think the most chilling thing in her book, School Wars, was really about the people sniffing the profits in private education. That is just awful. You know, I can see the kind of property managers who I'm dealing with on a daily basis seeing the revenues of running. They can employ a whole load of property managers. They can surely employ teachers, and you know, I can see a ghastly scenario there. So I'm absolutely with her to put a stop to that. But you know, private schools like Wellington. Wellington, I remember as a very, very sort of rural, hearty, sporty school. I managed to stop my sister from going. A lunatic idea of my mother's to send my sister there, and I thought, you know, a girl in a sixth form in a boys' boarding school. I just thought, you know, mad idea, absolutely mad. She's there purely for their benefit, not for hers. So she went to the local sort of state sixth form, and now, of course, you know, Anthony Seldon and Wellington have turned themselves into a sort of, you know, international business. Well, you know, with a copy of Wellington in Tianjin and a new one going to form in Shanghai. Well, you know, I sort of admire the commercialism of that, but they can pay taxes, you know, corporation tax on any profits repatriated here. If that's going to be a business, then they can cough up for it and be treated like a business and see what the consequences are for fees here, you know. So I would agree with that. I think, you know, I think that's probably the only, you know, points I've got to really make on this. You know.
Well, I think you raise a very common criticism about state education, which I think we have to face head on, that people can buy property, you know, what they call the postcode lottery. I mean, I think the right, I'm not saying you are in this case representative of the right, but the right make a lot of that when defending grammar schools, because they say, why shouldn't a poor child through a test that proves their intelligence go to a good school when the rich can buy a house in an area and go to a good school? I don't think it happens as much as people think. It certainly happens also within the grammar sector, but I do think we have to reform school admissions, and this is a hugely complicated area, but certainly the changes of the last 7 to 15 years have taken us in the wrong direction. The Academy and Free School movement have given now 70% of schools the right to control their own admissions, and given the harsh accountability system within the state system, schools are therefore under pressure to get them higher achieving children. And so there's all sorts of fiddling of, you know, the students that you get in. So this is a problem that has gone on for a long time, and it just needs, like all these things do, a mix of sensible, rational, state, national and local action. Because I think a local area, what used to be a local authority and still is, although their resources have been so depleted, so many of them are hardly able to do their job. In a local area, everybody knows which schools are kind of getting more of the privileged students and so on. I mean, what I should say is I think the aim within state education should be the ideal to get a balance within schools of academic and social and academic balance. But I think other things that would make a difference to that are if teachers were properly trained and properly resourced and treated as professionals, and more money was put into those schools that didn't necessarily have the sort of privileged students, that would make a huge difference. I mean, there's all sorts of ways we could really create a very, very good state system that would allow someone like you, as you were, to trust in it without having to purchase a big house. I would say, and this is more of a personal thing, I think that you said, you know, that you couldn't see an argument against sending your children to private school, one person out the state system, saving them a problem. I really don't see it like that. As somebody whose children have gone all the way through the state system, one of the things that most interests me is the difference in the kind of citizens it creates. So what I notice about the middle class in state schools is that middle class young people often come out with the same or better qualifications, go to the same or better universities than their privately educated counterparts, but they are completely different sort of people. But then what I think, they're different citizens. It's not about personal qualities. They have had different experiences. And I think one of the things that happens to the middle class within a state school is that they come up against the very thing, and I'm not saying this is what you do, but I think a lot of people choose private education because they fear state schools and they fear downward mobility and they fear their children having contact with those who have problems that cannot be overcome. But if you look at those young people, middle class young people who go into those state schools, there's ways, of course, the middle class find ways, many do, just to travel through a state school and out the other end without being affected by it. But I think many, it's their first and early and quite disturbing introduction to the society we actually live in. Now, that's not going to look good on a school prospectus, is it? But that is the truth about it. And I just find myself thinking about that a lot, and I don't know if it has any resonance with you. Obviously, your daughters are much older now, so it's not a raw experience. My daughters are still quite young. But I do notice that they were at primary school with people and friends with young people who then went on to private schools, and it's quite interesting how very, very different they are from those young women they were friends with 10 years ago who went to the same universities as them. But that's partly because of the social world that a private school has. You enter into different networks that promote advantage, but also limit, I would argue, the experience of those who are privately educated. I'm not saying that in a moral way, I just think it probably does. So those were 2 points that I wanted to make. I think that's probably enough.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to open the floor. So questions, please. There's a roving mic. So, okay, if you could. We'll start with Alison.
I think it's interesting what you say about thinking there's different kinds of people at private schools to comprehensive schools. So obviously, as an educational psychologist, I work mainly in state education, but I have relatives who sent their children to private schools and were then moving away from it. And I asked them why, and when they talked about all the problems that were going on, underage children accessing pornography, inappropriate images being shared, cyberbullying and stuff like that, it was exactly the same problems you get in a comprehensive, except it's easier for people like us to get in there and support them like that, and people are find it much more difficult to challenge and engage with parents who are more articulate and better educated. So I think you get the same sort of problems, but I think it's easier to access support for children in the state system. I've also seen a circumstance where another, private day school, where somebody was admitted at the age of 5, started progressing through the school. At a certain age, they found out she actually had dyslexia, wasn't making the kind of academic progress they wanted, and there was then pressure to get that child to leave the school, even though her sister was still at the school. So I think there are huge issues about inclusiveness when people are selecting for good exam results. I mean, I wonder what your thoughts about it are.
Well, it strikes me, and actually it's something Sebastian said as well, that, private schools are full of problems. And in fact, now we're discovering more about the social history of private schools. There's a guy called Alex Renton who's done a lot on the sexual abuse and in closed communities. But, I noticed 2 things. It never makes any difference to the kind of elite label of private schools. I think it's partly because the sector itself has refashioned itself now as the independent school sector. A new name helps. And partly because I've just come to conclude it's really all in the end, at the core of it is people's fear of poverty and moving down the social scale. And therefore, I almost can see parents who will choose a private school because they at least, if you're going to be bullied and you're going to be miserable, you're going to be miserable with people who've got a bit of money.
Could I answer?
No, but I'm not saying that's you.
No,
I'm just saying I think there's, I'm not even, I mean, that's the novelist in me.
Would you like to respond to
No,
that?
I think I'm sure that is a powerful motivation on some people. It absolutely wasn't for me and my wife. I mean, we wanted a school which was going to be happy and benefit the children. I didn't give a damn about exam results. Didn't give a damn about prestige and all the rest of it. Loads of people were in awe of Westminster, where a lot of posh, very bright girls go at sixth form in order to bump up the ratings, incidentally, because, you know, it's a wonderful thing if you could just get in a massive, you know, number of London private girls who will get them. But that wasn't, I'm in every school and in every environment, you can imagine from a person from my background where you know, where I experienced comfort and nurturing from my colleagues, my fellow pupils. I believe firmly that children sort out their own issues, and I absolutely hate this sort of Lord of the Flies issue of childhood anarchy, then children will all murder each other. That's not my experience. I found children fine. Adults were always the problem. So in a school, I always wanted to see a really healthy childhood culture. Where I got really agitated on behalf of my children was when some idiotic teacher was trying to sort of stop my younger daughter from going up to the middle school, the senior school. That was just going to cut her off from all her friends and sort of throw her out into the kind of, well, do exactly what they did with me at rugby, really. You lose all your friendship group. That was the cruelest blow, and it would have happened with her. And so, you know, the core thing was fellow people, but we were paying for it, and it was privilege, and that does have consequences. And I've acknowledged that, you know, I hadn't at the time, when it was relevant, thought it through. No, I don't have young children. I understand the consequences, but irrelevant there.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I can see that any parent wants their child to be happy. I think parents have other motives as well. I mean, I think that they're complex motives. But just on the thing of the happiness question, I'm not saying state schools struggle more to be happy, but I come back to the same point. If you have a school that has 40% of children whose parents are really in a dire situation, school may be the happiest place for them, but that's going to be at the very least a new, possibly disruptive, I think in a long term, really interesting element in the education of a child who comes from a comfortable house with a garden and books and so on. And I just think that's what's underlying a lot of this. I'm trying to get below the polemic and just talking about why parents choose things. And I think there are some middle-class parents who are just snobbish and racist, because I think there's a lot that's about ethnic background. But I think there's also some who are, you know, the sort of just anxious about that, but maybe are not even articulating it to themselves.
I think, yeah, that's undoubtedly true. I mean, I live in a very sort of mixed area of London. And we, you know, when my daughters moved at sixth form, I mean, I was very keen for them to go back into the States, you know, to go into the state sector. I went into the state sector, you know, at 16. They should have, you know, going to cope with their own education at that age was kind of my view. And we went down to Tiffin, which is a school in Kingston, selective school in Kingston, which is where Seamus Milne, you know, Jeremy Corbyn's chief of staff, sent his children. And it has a very high take of sort of, you know, non-white intake and all the rest, but it's absolutely not relevant. I mean, the Girls' Day Public School Trust at Streatham, to give it its due, it does have a big charitable arm to it. So the actual ethnic complexion of Streatham was in common with the community, I would say. Allane's, which was a very tolerant, nice, you know, glossy, pleasant school, was, I think, rather, and I did notice it was rather white and unrepresentative, shall we say, of southeast London. But I don't. But
you know what I find interesting listening to you is you have a tremendous detailed insider knowledge of all the private schools of London. I have a tremendous detailed insider knowledge of all the state schools of London. And this is another thing that happens. It becomes two overlapping landscapes in any given area. And why aren't we in a common landscape? I mean, we all, you know, why can't, and I do not underestimate the problems of moving towards a common landscape, but if we can't do that as a nation, not you, Sebastian, I'm not asking you to do it. But.
Well, I really agree with that, and I think that you're getting this with the sort of younger generation. You know, I think the new generation, I think wealth in the fact that they can't own, you know, the wealth inequality between the generations, I think, is going to drive huge changes. I think huge changes are afoot in our society, and I think you're absolutely right. And as I said earlier, I really think that people who may well be in government, even this year, should have some sort of plan for how they're organising, in my area, housing, and yours, education, and do it pronto.
I have another hand. Vivian first.
Yeah, I have a very detailed knowledge of the schools in the area where you live, Sebastian.
Oh, okay.
And I'm struck by the fact that you have two of the most high-achieving maintained state schools that you could have chosen, like Graveney or Burntwood, and why you didn't think your daughters could be happy there, what you felt they were going to access in an independent school that would make them happier than perhaps going to schools that were actually their local community.
Well,
That's what I don't quite understand. I can understand that, to me, private education is almost like social exclusion. You're excluding elements of society that seem to be unpalatable. You don't find children who grow up in poverty or live in extreme circumstances. So it's the motivation of the parents, this sort of notion that only Honeywell was the only primary school that you could consider, when there are absolutely hundreds of really good primary schools in the London Borough of Wandsworth.
Yeah.
It's a narrative I hear often from parents, and I totally understand people wanting to give their child the best start in life. But if we maintain and sustain this belief that you can't get that in the state sector, we're actually having a segregated society, which I think is really, morally bankrupt.
Okay, well, can I just answer? I mean, please, you shouldn't presume that it was entirely my decision. I mean, I went to Tooting Graveney at sixth form, admittedly, and I thought it was very impressive, and I listened to all the kids speaking, and I thought it was a really good school. Burntwood, I know, is a very good school, and down the road we went to Ravenstone was the primary school we used before they went to Streatham, and I think they would have all, sixth form, should we go back to, I had to listen to the opinion of my daughter. I said, do you want to go to Graveney, do you like Tiffin's? I thought Tiffin was a bit, highly competitive and not a very friendly atmosphere, to tell the truth. And Allane's was a very friendly, kind sort of atmosphere. And the social consequences of that, I admit that I'm blind to it, but it wasn't that, I want to be with posh parents. I would have absolutely loved to save the money. I'm not a rich man. Private education cost me a full 2/3 of my salary for many, many years. I live in a small terraced house off Ballamai Road.
Yes.
I acknowledge that.
Through the chair, please.
Can I just slightly respond to that? It's this notion that you claimed you were very unhappy in the independent sector, very happy in the comprehensive sector, but then when it came to decision-making about your children, that experience seems to have been lost.
Well, that's a very good question and a very nasty one, and it's why I've been sort of, rather in some fear of this debate, I have to say, because, what am I saying? Am I saying, to friends like Brian, I was really happy to, come and be educated at Farnborough Tech all together with you, but as soon as I had the opportunity, I reverted to posh boy type and sent my girls to, fancy London private schools. Well, he's got an absolute right to tell me to express his view on that. I absolutely don't believe that he would have that view. But in any case, there is another person involved in this, my wife, who made these decisions, who went to a comprehensive. But I acknowledge that the unfairness. I acknowledge that what we did was just have consequences further down the social, further down, knock-on effects. I absolutely don't dispute the excellent analysis by Melissa Benn, but I sort of wasn't thinking about it then. Maybe I'd do exactly the same thing, I have to say. I think I would choose the school where my child was happiest, even though it would be socially unfair and to the detriment of other people. I think I am a selfish parent.
Do you think we're going to give him lunch afterwards?
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. One more question, gentleman at the back.
Hi there. I haven't quite articulated this into a neat question, so forgive me, but I was thinking, we've been talking about private schools and state schools as though they're quite homogenous entities, and I was thinking, especially nowadays with the increase of things like academy change, when it comes to things like inclusivity and maybe an element of hidden selection going on, whether there's a kind of wolf in sheep's clothing situation going on, and how you think that focus on and drive towards an increase in improving state education kind of sits within that narrative?
That for anyone, for either? I mean, all I would say is the state system, which is educates 93% and is really what we should focus on. The 7% it's not irrelevant, but it is, you know, it's a small proportion. There's an enormous amount, you know, so much going on in that, and so many ways in which young people can be excluded and schools can get advantage and game the system and so on. So that's absolutely right. And that is something that anyone serious about reforming education would have to think about. And that then involves these deeply structural, technical questions about which, you know, are we going to go back to local authorities? We're going to have another kind of area authority. How are we going to deal with school funding, school admissions? All those things that are vital to creating a fairer system, but are not politically as sexy as going on about the private schools, but just as important. I mean, I could go on about this forever.
Right.
But
we are up against time deadlines. I'd like to end, rather unusually, by inviting both of you to say, are there elements of the other person's argument that you have great sympathies with? So are there elements, Melissa, of what Seb has been saying, which kind of resonate for you? And Seb, are there elements of Melissa's arguments that resonate for you? Perhaps we can start with Melissa.
You know, you've presented your argument in terms of your own personal dilemmas and choices and being very honest, and I appreciate that. And of course, I kind of get it. I get what you're saying about the choices that you made. I suppose when I listen to you, I kind of identify with what can feel like the parents who decided to make a different choice and felt, when it came to secondary transfer, as if 3/4 of the middle-class parents you've been at school with at primary level deserted a common project, which is not to criticise you, but I think that's a really powerful feeling that I have had, and that's what really propelled me into education. Why, if the primary school was good enough, which we could have made better, why did all this sorting happen at secondary level? And I've watched those consequences personally and politically of my daughter's cohort. So in a way I'm saying yes, and then I'm kind of saying yes a bit. Yeah.
Seb, are there elements of Melissa's arguments that resonate?
Yes, obviously. I mean, Melissa's book, writings, they're incredibly powerful, and they've made me think about this subject in a way that I haven't thought about before. And I remember when I was an editor, I employed a young woman from Dover Girls and University College London, and thought who was up against somebody from St Paul's and Oxford, and I sort of, it was actually their journalistic initiative that clinched it, but the woman from Dover won the toss, and I sort of thought that was a kind of tick for social mobility, but it obviously isn't really, and yes, I've learnt more. I think it was probably have been more relevant had I been younger and was making decisions for my children. I've acknowledged that I would act self-interestedly in this area in which I think you've got thousands of other parents doing the same thing. But I don't think that nobody would create an education system which we have afresh like this. Absolutely no one would do it. It's a bonkers system. But to overcome bits of it is going to take, well, to wither away is a good term, and I do hope that attitudes change, as it were. But it's a mountain to climb, this, and the previous trajectory of the last 30 years with massive wealth inequality, which we've got. I mean, look at one thing. I mean, when my parents sent me to Rugby, the school fees for a boarder for 1 year were £879. Now, adjusted for inflation, that should have been £9,755. £9,755 doesn't even get you a London day school. The real figure for 2016 was £34,000. That's massive. People are prepared to pay 3 times as much now for this than they were, 30 years ago. And I think things will change for the reasons that I've said. This sort of generational wealth inequality will have an impact on it. And I all part to Melissa's elbow. She's providing a powerful moral case for why people like me should really think about their decisions and the effect that it has on society. And, you know, I am thinking about it, but I'm old now, and it would have been relevant.
You're not as old as I am.
There's 1 year in
And
it.
on that note, I think we'll start. Folks, this has been completely nerve-wracking for these two. And I want to say how much I appreciate the time and effort and the bravery of both of them coming to talk on the same stage. Please, can we thank them in the usual way?